Andy, thank you for joining us. Why don't we start by you introducing who you are and what you do, and maybe tell us a little bit about your career thus far.
About half my work is writing and research about new ways of working, flexible working, or smart working, as we often call it. And the other half is advisory work. Done a lot of work with the government sector in the UK over the past 30 years, really. Really all levels of government with the European Commission, helping them to modernize the ways of working. And it's interesting about this conversation around hybrid working and remote working as if everything started in 2020. But we've got something like a 30-year prehistory of development of this kind of thing. And so I basically help organizations change the way they work and write about it. The idea is that we just got to get beyond this and think about the whole transformation of work. How can we make work better, more efficient? How can we make the work experience better wherever people are working?
Tell us a little bit about smart flexibility as a concept.
I think there's been a tendency, and this is partly enshrined in legislation and many organizations' policies. Flexibility is something that you apply for as being something separate from a normal default office-based way of working. Whereas what I try to help organizations implement is a much smarter kind of flexibility, which also looks at transformation.
I think the thing that I found really interesting about you and your work is that you have experience across sector, but you have done a fair bit of work with the public sector, haven't you, and government. At Cadence, we're working a lot with the public sector. We find we get lots of interest from public sector organisations, from the NHS to universities to government bodies. Can you maybe share a little bit about what you've experienced between public sector organisations and the private sector?
In the UK, we've been very fortunate in that within the Cabinet Office, there was always a group of very forward-looking people who were looking at how you can work in new ways outside of the bounds of the office. And I've also worked within hospitals and higher education. And that's quite interesting because I find there's often an enthusiasm for people in support functions to work flexibly, but a certain reticence amongst the sort of hospital consultants or the top level academics who really want their own space and are reluctant to change. So there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had around that.
So at Cadence, we often have a head of transformation that's our key stakeholder who's deploying the Cadence hybrid working platform. For us, that feels like a really positive movement, because if you have hybrid within transformation, then there's this room for testing and for trying things out and failing and tweaking.
In the past, I think it's often been driven initially by people within the workplace or facilities side of things, sometimes with an imperative to shrink costs and rethink that, or from within HR, where they're looking at things like recruitment and how to have more geographically agnostic kind of a recruitment, just getting the best people from wherever they are.
If we're thinking about a public sector organisation and they're new to the changes that their staff are probably asking for, maybe they haven't been doing hybrid and they're just starting to think about, right, what are we going to do? How do we create something that works for us? What would your suggestion be for where they start?
You need to have both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So having some awareness-raising work with the executive team, having interviewed with them about their priorities and what it is that they want to get better at. Because often people who are quite skeptical about more flexibility often are quite keen on various innovations and things within the areas where they work and don't quite see how the two things can marry up. So that's an important part of it. But then also to engaging with teams to analyze their ways of working. So you look at a kind of granular level at the activities people do, try and get concepts, try and get people away from the concept of this role has to be done like this, or this role has to be done like this, or you need to have a whole day here and a whole day there, and get down into the activities. And it's quite remarkable how enthusiastic people get about thinking how the work can be done better and how that can dovetail with also a better quality of life for themselves, better quality of work life and better quality of how that integrates with their overall work-life harmony. you need to have a focus as well on management by results. And all managers like to say that they do that. But when it comes down to actually identifying what the results are, that's when the interesting conversations begin.
Yeah. Any tips for managers on that one? Because I totally agree with you. There's this sense of course we do that. That's how, because we all want to manage that way, but the practical realities of whether we do or not are quite something else.
A lot of challenges, I think, around being able to manage on a new basis, particularly with the kind of dynamic flexibility. And so I think that is something that they struggle with. So there's something about the coziness of the familiar, which is drawing people back to simple solutions. But the future isn't going to go away, It's and I think it's really about managing in a different way with teams, having a lot more in the way of self-managed teams, and the role of the manager in coordinating those, in empowering people to be able to do the best work, and creating a culture of trust so that they can do that. And also seeing how, by having greater diversity over recruitment and so forth, you can really go to different places in your ways of working. Is that the particular unmet demand for flexibility is around older workers. So at the moment, there is a demand from parents, always has been, people with caring responsibilities. But a lot of them already have flexible working arrangements, which have been agreed through the various sort of policies or statutory processes, where the unmet demand is at a later stage in life. And that's partly because people don't employ older people. There's still that reluctance to do that. But it's also around the financial circumstances that one has. You still want to be able to contribute to your pension and so on. So I think in the coming years, we're going to have more conversations about flexibility around financial services over a longer life course.
Hybrid working makes us think of something, I think, quite specific, 3 days a week, for example, in the office. Whereas what you're talking about is just so much broader, which I think is your point with beyond hybrid working. I think it's worth me saying, as I work for a hybrid working platform, that for us right now, hybrid is a term that people just seem to, they feel somewhat comfortable with it. Yeah, anything you'd say to that? Because it's a bit of a contentious one at the moment.
If you're asking, how can we stop people from working from home 5 days a week, or how can we get people back into the office? You're asking the wrong questions. It's really about, as I said before, how can we make work better wherever people are working? So it's about having this concept of the extended workplace. People often tend to focus on having a desk in the office and a desk at home, and that's it. Whereas in the modern office, there are lots of different spaces that you can use, and finding that right space within an office or other workplace that you can use, working at client sites, working in third-party spaces, with co-working spaces, or flexible offices, or public spaces from public transport. And then there's possibility of working from home as well. And so how can we make work over all those? And partly that involves thinking about, well, let's make sure that the work works for people who are, rely on connecting digitally. And that's everyone, really. So rather than designing things primarily around an office way of working and then try to somehow transpose that into the online space, getting ways of working according to different kinds of work, which work for everyone, wherever they're working.
To just understand a little bit more about some of the specifics behind modernization, what is it that we really mean when we talk about modernization? Technology, but what else?
Really important to have a benefits-focused approach. Modernization is something that they do themselves rather than something which happens to them. And I think once you do that, you really get people on board. And I think you find that managers at every level are really quite keen on taking these conversations forward.
For the audience here, it would be super helpful to have some anecdotes, some examples of experiences that you've had with clients that you've worked with who brought you in to help them.
Indeed, there's right across sectors, like in defence and engineering, but also hospitals, universities, and police force. And I think one of the interesting things is that there's so many different kinds of work in some of these organizations that it's really about drilling down to the different kinds. And I think one thing which I've found almost consistently is that the program teams inside these organizations are very hesitant. They're very much worried about people rejecting everything. But what I've tended to find, like with the Merseyside Police, for example, there's a case study of those in the Smart Working Handbook, which is on the website. And actually, when they got the kind of middle managers together, people were remarkably enthusiastic for change. They could see all kinds of possibilities for doing things differently. There's also some quite interesting conversations that happen around the changing nature of workplaces within these organizations. And in particular, that has helped them to change according to the circumstances. So for like where they had a very major murder inquiry and they had to draft in lots of extra officers from neighboring authorities, able to have that flexibility for some teams to move elsewhere for the duration of this investigation and other people to move in. That flexibility was really important. And that's the same kind of thing that can happen within a medical setting as well, when there's some great crisis to deal with. And how are you able to flex the deployment of all your resources, including the space at a given time?